Hello, and welcome to what is tentatively being called, at the time being, Time to Draw. Basically, an excuse for me to work on some art that I've been meaning to and play around with my digital drawing software that is totally free for anyone to use. It's called Krita. I could compare it to a slightly worse functioning Facebook, if I'm being brutally honest. It 100% works, and I do enjoy using it, but it's Krita. That's the best way to describe it. Now, the goal of this is to really work on the concept art for one of my characters in an upcoming project I am working on. That character being, well, I don't want to reveal too much. That being said, the idea that I am working on is something called William Fats in Murder, Vampires, and a Really Good Steak. I understand it's a really stupid name, but the point of what that is in nature, it is a animated, intentionally campy noir horror series. I am in pre-production on it. I am one of the artists on it, as well as my dad doing the art for the other characters. The story focuses on the titular, William Fats, as he goes about the effort of solving a mystery that is quite literally handed to him a bit against his desires. Now, unfortunately, I'm not great at drawing human characters, so that leaves me with the not unwanted responsibility of drawing the vampiric characters. Well, I say vampiric characters, drawing any non-human character. And arguably one of the most important non-human characters is the one and only Cristian, the Vampire Night Lord, who you will meet in episode 1. Now, I said a lot of words there that probably don't mean anything, but in my mind, this all takes place in the town of New Salem. New Salem is essentially New York mixed with New Jersey, and the idea is basically everything is run by organized crime, corrupt city officials, and things of that nature. It's a rather unpleasant place to live, and one of the running jokes I have written into the rough drafts of the script I have is that you really only live here if you're aiming to become a monster, or you in fact already are a monster. Aiming to talk about the more hideously inclined of the people that exist in the realm of New Salem. Now, the character, as I mentioned, is named Cristian. Cristian is pulled from the Romanian name. I literally looked up some of the most popular Romanian names, and on that list was the name Cristian. There is no H, so it is spelled rather simply. Cristian, Cristian. And the idea behind Cristian is that I needed a character to serve as sort of a connector between what I imagine to be the vampires, which are important characters, obviously, in a story that specifically mentions them in the title, and the other sort of segments of the city. I needed a character to serve as the connector between the two. And what eventually came to my mind as I started working on earlier concept art for just characters that aren't going to appear either yet or at all was, well, if I'm doing a thing about organized crime, doing a noir story, which almost is a prerequisite to have crime at this level, why not make one of the characters sort of a major part of that? And in my mind, vampires are something I've not had a infatuation with, but I've enjoyed drawing and doing story concepts with for a long time. And with that, kind of birthed the idea of a vampire who would run all the vampire crime in the league. Well, not so much league, but the city. And that note brings about the fact that note would bring about the fact that the world at large is rather complicated and interesting in a way. It at least is evolving. Now, if you've noticed my screen suddenly going weird, that would be because Krita just entirely collapsed, and because I just started, I hadn't quite hit save yet. We're going to fix that now. Yeah. Right. Occasionally, Krita, at least on my computer, does in fact do this. Fortunately, we didn't lose much progress, so I'm not incredibly heartbroken over it, but it is a little aggravating at times. Back to where I was, though. The basic concepts behind this are that this is a love letter to the noir storytelling of things like Dick Tracy and movies like that, which I saw not when I was younger, but when I was definitely not quite a teenager yet. And I kind of fell in love with the style of those films. The lighting, the art direction, the way those films were done. And as I've gotten older, I've kind of fallen more in love with fantasy, fallen more in love with horror, but a passion for those crimes shows still kind of remains. The interest in seeing mysteries unfold and seeing how that it would interact with things of a supernatural ilk is always fascinating to me. And that's sort of what has birthed the whole concept behind New Salem, and more specifically the story of William Fatz, who is the main character. I'm not responsible for drawing him, but I did design him in a way. I told my co-artist what I was looking for in the design for William Fatz. And he's designed after Abbott from Abbott and Costello, only because I was like, you know what? I don't want like a handsome noir detective. I want just this dude who's just a dude. Sure, he's capable of his job and he's very good at it, but the issue at hand is more so he's called Fats for a reason. He's not a small guy. Now, if you're noticing as I'm drawing this, you're seeing a lot of sketch lines. This is how a lot of my art starts. I didn't really learn how to draw from anybody. I'm kind of mostly self-taught with a few books I read. My co-artist is definitely better than I am. And you can see that I'm already kind of very much breaking the kind of basic tenets of human anatomy, which some of that is in fact intentional. A lot of it is why I like drawing monsters. They don't follow the base rules of human anatomy. It's fine if they break, if they bend. And for a creature that is supposed to be a rather not old vampire, but a vampire of definite power and repute, I feel like they would look relatively unnatural at some point. Now, to talk more about the idea at large, and more specifically this character here, Cristian, I will be the first to say that he's already one of the characters I enjoy thinking about the most, because I've enjoyed doing his pen and paper concept art, and even so I imagine that it's just a fun concept for me to imagine the concept of vampire gangsters, or in this case mobsters, as that's what he is modeled after, the more so Italian mob structure, leading to him being very high up in the chain and holding a great deal of sway in how things go on in the city of New Salem. And that's sort of why he's a titular character and why he matters to the story at large. Not because he's the most important character, but definitely because he's a character that knows things that happen in the city. And if it happens in the city, there's a chance that it all comes back to him. I will be the first to say, though, that New Salem is still a work in progress in terms of its design and how characters will end up being. As I said, this is a rough for Cristian, and as I'm doing this for class, this will not be fully done, but I aim to have most of the rough body outline done by the end of this, hopefully done with clothes. You notice now that right now the head's off, which is always interesting to deal with. Put it up. There we go. Yeah, Krita has a lot of tools that when you get used to using them, you can do a fair bit with. I'm going to fix his head a little here, just so it doesn't look like it's so awkward. He still is meant to be very tall and gangly, but functionally he's meant to be somewhat human. At least not to the point where he's recognizably human, very much to the point of the uncanny valley is probably the best way to put it. He's meant to kind of be that degree of inhuman. You look at him in passing, he looks awkward, but then you get close, you realize, oh no, this thing isn't human in the slightest. Which quite honestly is how I prefer to do a lot of my take on vampires honestly goes more that way. Creatures that are sort of this thin veneer of humanity, bolstered by a even thinner veneer of actual like decorum and planning. Of course, I also do love doing vampires as the schemers, as the ones who are planning and developing things, concepts and ideas. That's always a fun thing for me to work with. So this is sort of my best of both worlds, if I'm to be brutally honest. It's very much a character that is entirely self-indulgent. I've been working on similar characters several times for now, all designed off these same sort of base principles of very bestial in nature, very much breaking human form, breaking the definitions at least of human form. So you'll see a lot of gangly limbs, sunken faces, very long, very tall. Characters that are obviously inhuman but relish the worser parts of humanity, i.e. things like gluttony, things like just violence. And that's sort of what he's based on. There's a character I was working on for the longest time. It was a rough story concept that saw a vampire named Orlando operating in America with sort of degree of political immunity given his special status. And that was sort of one of the working inspirations for this character. Someone who is powerful enough to be feared, but knows that they're immortal. They don't have to worry about schemes and plans and working on the finer things in life. They can take it slow and enjoy. They're playing the long game. They have all the time in the world. Of course, not completely true. Vampires are not immortal, for which I've sort of described the extent of New Salem in a nutshell, I feel. Hopefully you find it interesting as I'm drawing this. I don't want to say too much because very much the story is up in the air and it is intentionally campy. It's designed to be, as I said, a love letter to things like Dick Tracy, a lot of those pulpy detective novels, and it's almost fair to say that it's less of a love letter to those. It could almost be considered a more love letter to the Italian Giallo films, or Giallo films if you feel like saying it like that. Filthy American, so I say it that way. They are a special brand of horror film that specifically originate really only in Italy. And there are some excellent examples, beautiful cinematography, beautiful design. But what really sets them apart is the way that those films are made. They're made to be almost more thrillers with the horror-esque kills and violence, echoing out to be these sort of monstrous films, but they keep the killers different from like the masked killers, like your Jasons and your Freddys, your Michael Myerses. They're not human per se. They're very much still monsters, but it's a different type. It's not even to say more nuanced. It's a different level of aggression, a different type of aggression, if you will. And I've always kind of enjoyed how those films look, how they're shot, and how they handle their concepts of fashion and their villains. And that's something I wanted to carry over. I wanted to do a lot of like, your villains aren't poorly dressed people slovenly slabbed together in clothes that are like drawn from a barn. Your villains, your heroes are all going to be wearing shirts and ties, again, product of the times. They're going to be these well-dressed ladies and gentlemen that hail from very unearthly places. Because part of the characters that I'm not designing include one or two half-angels that will appear at least in the first script, as well as a semi-humanoid character that I have the pleasure of drawing the monstrous form of. In no specific order, the names of the half-angel is Trish, not named after any specific reason, more so just I needed a name and Trish was the name I came up with. The human with a monstrous form is named Abergast. Again, no specific reason. It's one of my go-to kind of fake names for things. I've used it in D&D, I've used it in writing, I've used it in several other things I've worked on. Just because it's one of those sort of outlandish names that sort of feels right. It feels like it should be something. And when it turns out to be nothing, you're like, oh, I mean, I guess that's fine, but it feels like that should be something. I will be the first to say that obviously this idea is inherently kind of weird. And a part of that's by design. And as you can see, this art gets messy as well. But part of that is definitely by design, the weirdness of this, because I want it to be campy. I want it to be off-putting in a way that, not disturbing off-putting, but very much the kind of off-putting where it's definitely not designed for everybody. It sort of exists in its own little world and niche. The way this is getting made is something that I'm honestly excited about. It is not any sort of process that I am familiar with. It's, as I said, it's not quite true animation. It's probably better to be called a motion comic. Something designed to simulate motion in specific moments without necessarily having true motion. So a lot of these images will end up being assets that get used for the project. So eventually I will remove the background from this, and once that background is in fact removed, that'll be when I go in and will place this in different... I'll be able to play around a little more and design this more so in a way that better fits the purpose of being moved around and thrown into various closer to animation-based situations. Again, it's concept art, so I'm not completely sold on anything yet, but very much what you're seeing is sort of the rough idea that I had in my mind for what the character of Cristian should be and will likely end up being fully. Not quite at a place where I'm willing to stop yet, but you're getting a rough idea of the shape. Very much he's modeled off Italian suits and stuff, and while I'm not looking at a model, this is sort of the base design of the coat. Obviously the coat will come down more to here, hang a little lower on the hands. Pants will be thinner, and I plan to bring his torso in more. Perhaps pinching it. I'll actually probably draw that now. Yeah. As I said, Krita is free for anyone interested. I'm not sure who is, but I've enjoyed using it. I'm still getting used to it, if only because drawing digitally is a far cry from how I draw on pen and paper. For me, pen and paper is a lot more just kind of go and we'll see how the wind takes you. And this seems a bit more, not demanding, but requiring the intent to go somewhere with. It's, again, not a bad thing. It's just something I've noticed as I've tried to get more and more used to it. As you can see, this is getting a little messy. Normally I break my layers up a bit more and there's a lot more erasing and redrawing and stuff, but as it is now, this is, again, it's a rough concept, so I'm not panickingly worrying about getting things done quite correctly. I am going to, in fact, check how the body type is going. It should be that, there we go. So you sort of can roughly tell here that this is sort of, this will be the rough estimation of his, I keep forgetting I changed that size. This is the rough estimation of kind of his torso to body ratio. I'm actually going to bring that coat down a little more. I think it should be lower. And as you can see, it's, again, unnatural in every capacity, but that is by design. I want Cristian to be noticeably inhuman off the bat for anybody watching. or even anybody tentatively seeing art for the series. And I think there's very little way you look at him and get an idea that, oh, this is a perfectly normal person. I want it to be obvious that this New Salem, the city in question, is a city full of monsters, full of things that do not like you, will kill you, and really have no attachment to mortal things like understanding or morality. And that plays into one of the plot devices for this first, I say season in the lightest sense of the word, but it is in fact planned to be a season. The first season focuses on the story of vampires murder and a really good steak, or murder vampires and a really good steak, which is entirely based around the sudden death and possible cover-up of a man, well, half-devil, called Kestrel Downs. That is, the entire first season is based on the investigation into that. These ones farther down the line, I have ideas for. I have characters I want to draw and I'm interested in drawing. But that's a matter of having to get to that point, obviously, and as well as production not dying over the time it takes me to get this first one out. I've kind of made it a point to say I know for a fact this first one will be getting made no matter how ugly or how much of a failure it is. I think it's a fascinating story in my head. I know this has been relatively disjointed, but if you keep an eye out on this channel specifically where it's getting posted, you'll likely see more updates from me on the relation of things getting posted, of things getting developed as they go. My co-artist is handling the human characters, and specifically is handling all human characters for this, so they're responsible for getting me those. But as a rough start, this is what we'll end up with after a quick cleanup from an eraser. This is the rough beginnings, concept art, if you will, as I called it at the beginning, of the Night Lord of New Salem, the only North American Night Lord in the world, Cristian. Again, it's obviously very rough, but you get a brief kind of smattering of the idea. You'll have the long, gangly arms, the very thin torso secured tightly around with a shirt, a nice red tie, button shirt, the Italian-style suits coming together to suit it quite nicely. I do also feel, as you can see with the face, you can see the effects I'm going for. I'll have the kind of sunken-in jaws that lead into a mouth that juts upward with fangs pointing down, the pointed ears, the hair. I'm still not sold on. The other pen and paper art I've designed has it more of a split and pulled up to this side. I'm trying something here with a pronounced widow's peak and hair kind of coming down. Not entirely sold on it. Normally, for the final product, the face will be touched up a lot. I'll go back through with a much smaller pen, but to give myself a rough layout for the sake of the drawing, and to sort of give all of you a decent idea of what this looks like. The upper body is mainly what is actually important right now. As you can see, the legs are starting to bleed through, but I can go ahead and erase those very quick. I need to redraw them anyway. As you can see, my process is the opposite of clean in any capacity. But this is the rough approximation of the Night Lord Cristian, who will be the owner of the Real Life Revelry Bar in William Fat's, also in Vampires, Murder, and a Really Good Steak. I know it's been a little boring watching me draw, having created a crash, and then watching me draw some more, but this has been drawing time with Hunter Geiger. Social media doesn't really exist yet, but it will likely be coming up, specifically designed either for this or for my channel. I do technically have two. The one this is posted on is Sketchwolf, just kind of my go-to very general channel. I do have a channel where I post other content, most of it sporting related, and a D&D campaign that needs updating. but that is Down the Stairs. It's, again, mostly UFC content so far, but as I get updates and trailers, those will be going on to the Down the Stairs channel. And I do plan to actually get social media together for this, or at least for Down the Stairs, to kind of address the updates and process for creating this. It's an exciting project, and thank you all for jumping in and kind of seeing the beginning, not the beginning thought process, but seeing very much the beginnings of an asset for the project in our wonderful Night Lord Tristan. Well, I thank you again for coming in, and I thank you again for listening. So, have a wonderful time. And I will see you in the lovely town of New Salem, when I learn to animate and to get this guy moving and dancing like any proper Night Lord should. Adieu.